So I have honor to invite dear Janusz Bugajski, Senior Fellow of Jamestown Foundation, Washington, D.C., author of Failed State, A Guide to Russia Rupture book. We have two authors today, Janusz and Andrey, so please.
May I say one word, so that it's a thanks. I read the book of Mr. Bugajski. That was the reason that convinced me to send a mail to Oleg, and that was the way we were in touch 1 year ago. So thank you for your inspiring books and your inspiring words that this is the beginning of the involvement of the Italian Parliament. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for those words. And thanks to Oleg. Oleg's gone somewhere, he's at the back. Thanks to Oleg and Taras hasn't been mentioned, for not only organizing the forum, but developing this forum, expanding its importance around the world. We were together in Tokyo, in London, other places. And thank you to our Italian hosts for being so far-sighted, more far-sighted than many politicians I know in Washington, and for not accepting the status quo with Russia. In other words, as you mentioned in your speech, we have to be creative, we have to be innovative, we have to be imaginative. So, last word before I actually make my remarks, Taras gave me a copy of the Russian version, Russian translation of my book. Poor Taras had to carry a whole bag full of them from Kiev to Rome. They are circulating in Russia, as far as I know.
And here, also here.
Oh, and, yes, there you go. So anybody in the North Caucasus who wants a copy as well will be welcome. Okay, I'm going to focus my remarks, and I'll try and be as brief as possible, on the importance of discussing Russia's rupture. Such discussions, I believe, are extremely valuable to undermine the ideological and political foundations of the International Alliance of Dictators, which was the sort of topic that Oleg said. Let me start by asking whether everyone has noticed that the more we discuss the collapse of the current Russian Empire, the more voices we hear in the West urging us to shut up and be quiet. At least that's what I'm told at times. Some of our alleged Russia and Western security experts want to convince us that we should refrain from advocating systemic change in Russia or the outright disintegration of the failed state. But the reasons they give are not only unconvincing, they are often contradictory, comical, and ultimately counterproductive. So let me give you 3 examples. First, some Russia experts claim that disintegration will definitely not happen, but at the same time they warn us that the world will become more perilous if it does happen. Well, if it won't happen, then why be so fearful that it will happen? Secondly, they claim that we have no power to make disintegration happen, but at the same time they warn us that it is dangerous to even wish for such an outcome. Evidently, wishing can become reality. Hence, there must be something quite powerful in such wishes. And third, they claim that talking about disintegrating Russia actually helps Putin's propaganda in the West. And I hear this from some of the Russian liberals. They differ in many respects, but they keep repeating this line. But if the Kremlin is taking Russia's disintegration seriously, then we should also be closely examining the developments, the scenarios, and the consequences that the Kremlin actually fears. It's not our fear, it's their fear. Fortunately, most of us live in democracies, and the self-appointed pro-Russian security censors will not prevail. I will raise 6 fundamental points, and I'll try and be brief. Cut me off if I'm running too long. I'll raise 6 fundamental points why the question of Russia's dissolution cannot be ignored. It is vitally important for international security to focus our discussions on Russia's rupture and to start preparing to manage for the consequences. First, talking about Russia's demise does not help Putin. Fear about Russia's collapse and arguing for the importance of preserving the Russian imperial state actually helps Putin, much more than talking about its weaknesses, its failures, and its rupture. The Russia continuity argument, I would call it the Russia continuity argument, reinforces the Kremlin myth that Russia is invincible, indestructible, and permanent. And it precludes policy planning, which I think is vital for all future scenarios. We never plan ahead enough in the United States, and it's the same in Europe, in NATO in Europe. Many in the West bought into the Soviet permanence theory. I remember it very well, how one would argue that the Soviet Union is not going to be permanent. And now they continue with the Russian permanence theory. Political fiction, I believe, is a belief that imperialist states are permanent. Analyzing Moscow's numerous failures helps us to prepare Western policy for Russia's dissolution, unlike our lack of preparation for the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. We need to help our allies to prepare for the consequences. Drawing conclusions from the evidence about Russia's impending collapse does not help the current regime, but exposes the failure of that regime and the state. Second, planning for Russia's rupture is not a distraction from winning the war in Ukraine. I keep hearing about this. This is a new argument that's now being made. In fact, I think it is a core element of Moscow's defeat, precisely because it exposes the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of the Russian state and helps Ukraine and its partners to probe and widen those weaknesses to defeat the empire. You can both defend Ukraine and you can help to manage the consequences of the breakup of the Russian so-called federation. It is also a psychological morale booster for Ukraine, a nation under threat of genocide. What will be the level of trust among neighbors, particularly Ukraine, in a new Russian leader who poses as a democrat but preserves the current empire while feigning agreements with Kiev or even recognizing its borders while planning for its next imperial resurgence? 3. Discussing Russia's rupture is not wishful thinking. This is another phrase I keep hearing. When I published the book, I was told I'm a wishful thinker. Well, I would call it willful thinking. Actual wishful thinking was the post-Cold War idea of long-term, mutually beneficial relations between the West and Russia, the current Russia. Many believed in this grand illusion for at least 20 years, and some still do. More wishful thinking is exhibited in the notion that a handful of liberals and Democrats, either in prison or in exile, can transform the empire into a democracy. We had other wishful thinking on display at the start of the Yeltsin, Putin, and Medvedev presidencies. I remember well how those who questioned the survival of the USSR were dismissed as wishful thinkers. Well, what about the wishful thinking? Put Medvedev as a great pragmatist, somebody that we could work with. This has become the most, even before Putin's statement, this has become the most blatant, open imperialist and pro-genocidist. Or those who pointed out after Putin was installed in power that Russia was engaged in a new imperial drive. They were dismissed as Russophobes. Okay, me included. Point 4, focusing on Russia's demise does not provoke Moscow or escalate conflict. The Kremlin claims that the West wants to destroy Russia regardless of actual US policy. It's quite comical, really. The regime's survival is based on stoking fear and conflict irrespective of Western policy. And I point this out to our policy people. The more you deny that you want to break up Russia, the more Moscow will assert that there is a secret plan to do that, to destroy the empire. And I also point out, Western leaders spent 20 years trying to convince Russian leaders that NATO is not a threat. Now, where did that get us? Where did that get us? Nowhere. It is better to state clearly what the West supports in Russia: democracy, pluralism, federalism, national and regional self-determination, and independence for those republics and regions that want it, to finally and firmly break with Moscow. 5th, talking about Russia's rupture actually helps to counter Kremlin disinformation and conspiracy myths. I don't call them theories, because theory gives it credibility. Conspiracy myths. Basically, we have nothing to hide. What does the West have to hide? Openly declared support for democracy and federalism, the rights of republics and regions to determine their status, their autonomy, their sovereignty, their statehood, can help embolden citizens and demonstrate that they are not isolated in the world stage, despite Moscow's oppressive and isolationist policies. And as you said, sometimes you have to fight for this. Why should we be ashamed of these fundamental principles of social coexistence? Avoiding such talk demonstrates fear of authoritarianism and imperialism rather than resistance against it. Last point, 6, discussing Russia's rupture helps Russia's citizens. Instead of avoiding the subject, the outside world has many mechanisms to better inform Russian citizens about the importance of de-imperialization and the benefits of either genuine federalism or the formation of new states that can forge peaceful relations with neighbors. Supporting self-determination gives hope to citizens. Otherwise, it looks like the Western and Eastern democracies have abandoned them, and they will face years of war, repression, impoverishment, and international isolation. You have to give them some sort of hope, and I believe Russia's rupture is that very hope. So lastly, very last point, I would say fear of discussion, avoidance or dismissal of certain topics, or trying to silence others is no way to conduct or advise policy making or to plan for the future. The brave new world beckons the bold and innovative thinkers and will leave the real Russophobes, those that actually fear Russia, a long way behind. Thank you.